We all make mistakes, right? We try really hard not to, but they happen. And burying a loved one is a horrible thing. What if you buried your loved one and they were actually alive? Oh, no. You didn't bury them alive, but rather you buried someone else, someone not your loved one. Your loved one is still alive somewhere out there in the world. It would be an absolute relief and would bring such joy. But then you have to wonder, just who in the hell did I bury? Because these older stories tend not to have a lot of closure and do not get drawn out, we're going to bring you a handful of shorter stories. 1919, Bangor, Maine. Wilfred Oakes served in the war as a member of the Canadian Artillery Regiment and saw his own grave, his name inscribed on a slab over the last resting place. He took a picture. He had enlisted in 1914 when he was 17 years old. He lied about his age and made himself older when he enlisted. Oakes has been cited for bravery and received a Medal of Honor. He had been severely wounded several times and experienced the worst of experiences. In one particular battle, he lost his ID card, his jaws were shot away, and he was unable to communicate what his name was. Of course, being in the hospital for a period of time and unable to communicate, his company reported him missing and then dead. Unfortunately, that means that someone else's soldier, son, brother, husband was buried by his family instead of him under his name. After surgery, he had new jawbones, his tongue sewn up, and other issues fixed. Now, why wasn't his information communicated to his company or his family? He probably had no idea what was happening while he was trying to recuperate in the hospital. Unfortunately, there was no update to the story that I could find, and I'm sure he got in touch with the people who were mourning him, and hopefully they relocated that buried soldier with his own family. 1914, Vermont. Patrick Driscoll was believed to have been dead in an accident involving a train, and then he showed up alive. So now authorities are wondering about the dead man and how Patrick's brother and two cousins could have identified this body as Patrick's, when obviously it wasn't, and how his family took the body to the Driscoll family plot and buried him. Patrick read about his death in the newspaper while he had been out working at the White River Lumber Drive, and as soon as he saw the news, he headed for Montpelier to show that he was indeed alive. He went to authorities to confirm his aliveness and his identity. Then he headed to the home of a cousin who didn't recognize him at first and then nearly passed out when she did. So now, what of that body that got buried? Authorities are up in the air at the time of this article, but it's assumed that the body will probably be exhumed from its place in the Driscoll family plot and then identified and buried elsewhere. It's also possible that the Driscoll family will not get back their $50 in funeral expenses, unless the town reimburses them. Apparently, the deceased man looks enough like Patrick to be a twin from what I read. So then there was a sort of update. The body of the mystery man buried next to the body of Patrick Driscoll's father will be exhumed. A large crowd is expected for when the body is dug up and the casket opened. I guess there aren't any county fairs going on at this point. One cousin knew that the body wasn't Patrick's, but decided that he must have been wrong when other family members had identified the body. The police of Montpelier think that the dead body, not yet identified, may be a, quote, roving character known as Alligator Pete. And again, I couldn't find an update on this story to see if that body was indeed this so-called character, Alligator Pete, but hopefully they were able to find out who that was. 1921, Wilmington, North Carolina. Leon E. Smith, or at least someone who they thought was him, had died and he was buried. Imagine their surprise when he returned very much alive and not covered in cemetery dirt. A friend in a nearby town told Leon about the hullabaloo, and Leon quickly returned to his hometown to show that he was indeed very much alive. Apparently, another man who had been found beside a railroad track and whose body was mutilated was positively identified by a friend that it was Leon. Oddly, letters addressed to Leon were found on the body, so that seemed to seal the deal, and Leon's family claimed the body to have him buried in the family plot. Whoops. I am curious about the letters. Wonder if that guy was trying to somehow steal Leon's identity or what. Once again, no update to what happened with this. 1930, Baltimore. Nephews and nieces thought they were attending the funeral of their uncle, William Lewis. On returning from the cemetery, they spotted their Uncle William standing at a street intersection and very much alive. Police changed the records to show that an unknown man had been buried. The coroner shrugged his shoulders because he couldn't do anything else and wouldn't give them their funeral expenses back. Now, how did we get here? A man had been found dead in a park, and another man identified it as an uncle who had lived with him for 15 years, and that was also confirmed by other nieces and nephews. So this is a dad joke that was in the Bridgeton Pioneer newspaper, 1900. Quote, "This is a grave error," end quote, remarked the undertaker when he found that he had buried the wrong man in the wrong lot. Milwaukee, 1908. Last summer, Mrs. Hattie Politz brought from California to Oshkosh, Wisconsin, the charred body of a man and buried it in Riverside Cemetery because she believed it to be the body of her husband. The two had been separated since the San Francisco earthquake. I'm assuming the big 1906 one, and each had believed the other to be dead. Recently, she learned that her husband was living on a ranch in California. A long-distance telephone conversation soon confirmed the fact, and Mrs. Politz at once prepared to leave for Stockton, California. The joy of the reunion will be marred by a sadness, for one of their children had been killed accidentally since the husband and wife were separated, and another child born since then did not live. Of these things, as well as to the whereabouts of his wife, Mr. Politz was in ignorance. He mourned his entire family as dead. The family lived in an apartment house in San Francisco at the time of the earthquake. In the awful days following the disaster, the husband and wife became separated. Again, there's no update with this. Hopefully the buried man was exhumed and relocated, although depending on the state of the body, that may have been difficult to identify back in those days before DNA testing. 1931, Butte. Imagine the surprise felt by George Early of Butte when he received a telegram from his brother at Rock Falls, Illinois, which read, quote, "I buried you here several months ago. Glad to hear you are still on top," end quote. Thus was revealed how a dead man, now thought to have been Tom Brown, was mistakenly identified as George Early, claimed by Early's relatives and buried. Brown, a former cabin mate with Early, died of natural causes here last May. Known as Brown, the finding of letters in his pocket addressed to Early aroused official suspicion that instead of Brown, the man really was Early, but, like many another, had taken on another name, perhaps for convenience. The coroner's office notified C.F. Early of Rock Falls, whose name appeared in the letters. Early came to Butte, examined the body, and accepted it as that of his brother, and returned it to Rock Falls for burial. At the time, Early said he had expected to find a different-looking body, but that as he hadn't seen his brother for 30 years, he easily could be mistaken in his idea of what his brother's body should look like. Yeah, that I could understand. More than the previous story where someone had lived with the being for 15 years and misidentified him. 30 years and no eyes on him? Yeah, I can understand that. Meanwhile, George Early was working near Cody, Wyoming, and only recently returned to Butte. Here he learned that his old pal, Tom Brown, had died. Subsequently, he learned from his brother that Brown had been identified as himself and that legally George was dead. Last week, Early and the coroner started proceedings to straighten out the tangled identities from which Early hoped to emerge legally alive. 1909, New York. The request of Mrs. James P. Hoover that the police seek her missing husband was the first intimation the public had that he was not buried last Sunday afternoon in the graveyard at New Brunswick, New Jersey. Mrs. Hoover explained that after an unexplained absence of 5 weeks, she and his relatives identified a body which had been floating in New York Bay off Staten Island as that of her husband, and she spent $125 for the funeral last Sunday, which was largely attended. She went into deep mourning. Quote, "Several hours after the funeral, I was startled by the return of my husband, whom I believed I had just buried. He explained that he had been away looking for work and did not want to come home until he found a job. He remained with me until Monday night, when he went out to meet some friends, and since then he has failed to return, and I would like to have the police find him." End quote. So did she find him? I hope so, although one wonders if he wanted to be found. 1913. So I'm throwing this one in, not a wrongly buried body, more like where in the hell is this guy buried? John Wilkes Booth, famous guy, or infamous rather. We're not going to get into his activities while he was alive, as those are well known. In short, he shot President Lincoln in Ford's Theater, and Lincoln later died. But we will touch on his activities after his death. Where did Booth get buried? Back in 1913, it was apparently not an easy thing to answer, or rather 4 different men of highfalutin titles didn't know, or thought they did. General Lew Wallace wrote before his own death, quote, "John Wilkes Booth was buried under a brick pavement in a room of the old penitentiary prison of Washington City." End quote. General Dana, quote, "He was buried out in the old Navy Yard, and a battery of artillery ran over the grave to obliterate any trace of it." End quote. Colonel Wood of the U.S. Secret Service, quote, "The body of Booth was taken off the steamer Ida April 27, 1865, down the Potomac River and carried to an island 27 miles from Washington and secretly buried there." The story was given out that Booth had been buried under the flagstone in the district jail, was only told to keep the public mind at ease and to satisfy public curiosity. End quote. Captain E.W. Hillard, quote, "I was one of the 4 privates who carried the remains of Booth from the old Capitol Prison in Washington to a gunboat, which carried them about 10 miles down the Potomac River when the body was sunk in the river." End quote. So, wait a minute. What? Where is he buried? Supposedly, he was buried in Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore in 1869 after having had his body sewn into a horse blanket and transported to D.C. via the Potomac River. Autopsied in the Navy Yard. First, he was buried in the old penitentiary. Then he was exhumed and reburied in 1867 in a warehouse at the penitentiary, and then in 1869 his remains were exhumed again and released to his family. He was buried in Baltimore in the Booth family plot. It's believed that a small unmarked stone is his, but some believe that may be another family member's, and that it's unknown by those outside the family which one is actually his. I'm guessing to keep from vandalism or other nefarious activities. So make sure you know what your friends and family look like. Given social media and the ease with taking pictures on your phone, or how much easier it is to visit your physically distant relations, I can't imagine burying a misidentified body happens too often anymore. At least, I hope not. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more, please like and subscribe. Thank you.